Yeah. So I did a show recently, and the majority of this set is going to be taken from it. It was called Autistic License. It's about me growing up autistic. Now, normally I do a bit of a, play around explaining autism, but it's like, just getting a feel for the room. It's like, oh, will I have to explain to the room full of people with narrow prescribed interests what autism is? I heard the ripples at the Star Trek and the Lord of the Rings stuff, which is all very well and good, but I don't understand Lord of the Rings from an autistic point of view because it's I have enough trouble understanding the current spoken language without having to invent an entirely fictional one. But for those of you who don't know what autism is, it means that I was born just like you, feel empathy just like you, perceive the world around me just like you, but the difference is that I read the entire iTunes user agreement. In depth. I scrolled right to the bottom. Everybody thinks it's Bill Gates, but no, it was old Stevie. He was the one on the grift. It's annoying though, because before the pandemic, I could make fun little, self-referential jokes because of Andrew Wakefield, about vaccines. But it feels cheapened now. It's just to reassure you, I was this level of autistic before the pandemic and before my 3 jabs. And it sucks because they've muddied the waters, and I had loads of fun little, clever jokes about misinformation and vaccines. And in a weird way, I don't know if you've noticed, but the current anti-vaxxers, they're all about mitochondria and they're about these alleged long-term side effects, but none of them are bigging up the autism anymore, like they did with MMR. And I don't know, I feel weirdly singled out that I'm not the worst case scenario anymore. But it's as Oscar Wilde said, the only thing worse than being talked about is having to abandon a substandard bit on stage. So, I do a history of autism bit in my show, and it really briefly goes through the multiple experts and potential origin points of autism advocacy. Traditionally, we start the story about 1938 with Hans Asperger giving a lecture, but I'm not going to lie, read his biography, was really hard to find details that I could turn into jokes, because it's quite a bleak period of history, you can imagine. It's Hans Asperger went to college with Dr. Erwin Jacilius, who oversaw the transportation and eventual killing of over 200,000 children with disabilities, but in his original university, his boss's name was Dr. Hamburger. Hamburger. What's the bloody deal with that, eh? Asperger, Hamburger. What's the bloody nurse's name? Ms. Fillet of Fish. But it turns out that murmuration of laughter isn't sufficient to take you away from the Holocaust without a really jarring movement. By the way, I was diagnosed in the 90s, so Asperger's syndrome was the term used back then. You can imagine how fun that is, explaining that on the playground. Haha, Asperger's, Ian has Asperger's. Bearing in mind, Gen Zers in the audience, this was in the 90s, before eating ass was cool. So, two of the people who closely worked with Hans Asperger, Annie Weiss and George Frankl, end up fleeing from Vienna because they were Jewish, and a lot of academics had to leave. And they started working for a guy called Leo Kanner, who completely coincidentally comes up with this new autism spectrum disorder in 1943. Kanner had a very restrictive view of what he thought autism should or shouldn't be. Number one, he thought that it was incredibly rare. It's not, it's 1 in 59, last count. 2, he thought that it only occurred in children, which is weird. He had this notion that the autism would either go away as they got older, or it would digivolve into schizophrenia, neither of which it turned out to be is the case. Yeah, that's a lovely little phrase, because if you take apart that metaphor, digivolve implies a level of transience where they're going to return to a different state at some point. But I learned really early on in comedy that if you just sprinkle in a pop culture reference in a joke that doesn't have a punchline, people eat it up like fucking jackals. It's great. But thirdly, he thought, now he didn't take it to its full conclusion, but he thought that autism was caused by something called refrigerator mothers. And yeah, like I don't want to be too harsh on the dude with him because I know he was like a Freudian. I know that was his background. Everything's about childhood trauma with those people. But his idea was that these kids aren't getting enough nurturing at home and it's causing them to act out. And the really annoying thing is it made him really dismissive of autistic kids. If he saw one doing like an amazing maths equation, he'd go, well, clearly that child has only done that to, get attention from his indifferent mother. And in terms of things that autistic people excel at, I find that really patronizing. If you were to imply that I only go on stage, right, and tell jokes because I didn't grow up in a loving enough environment. Anyway, so there was a lot of like playing around with the definition of autism, but there wasn't a established treatment. Actually, now at this point in my show, I normally go on to Ivor Lovaas and the establishment of applied behavioral analysis, but I got a little bit of flack from real like psychiatry whizzes about the fact that I don't include Bruno Bettenheim in my show. Like he's absent, and to be honest, the reason that Bruno Bettenheim isn't in my show is because Ranish, really took the refrigerator mother thing to its extreme conclusion. He had this concept of something called a parentectomy, where you take the child away from the home because clearly that's what's causing the autism. Corporal punishments, a few electrocutions. He may or may not have killed a kid on a summer vacation, completely indistinct from his psychology work. And, well, to top it all off, he wasn't even a fucking doctor. His PhD was in art history. Which, funnily enough, that's the thing that everyone talks about. It's not the abusing kids. It's like, well, no, only people with a PhD can do that. Thank you very much. But yeah, to summarize it neatly, we don't talk about Bruno. So, pop culture. Yeah, Ivor Lovaas, he came up with applied behavioral analysis, a very controversial intervention for autism. He was a failed psychoanalyst before he went into behaviorism. He actually has a quote in Time magazine where he said, yes, people would often ask me, if I speak to you in a psychotherapy session, will I feel better? And I would say yes. They did not feel better. In fact, they quite often felt worse. Imagine putting that out as a testimonial about yourself. Like, if you came to one of my shows expecting to feel really happy and you ended up really bummed out by the end, I mean, I'd be okay. I'd probably get a Netflix special out of that, but it wouldn't be great advertising. So he developed something called applied behavioral analysis. It was based on the idea that, like, undesirable behaviors such as, like, flapping hands or not making eye contact could be, like, you could use positive or negative conditioning, like dog training, on the kid to instill that. Weirdly, he ended up working on something else shortly afterwards. It was called the Feminine Boy Project, and it later became what we now know as conversion therapy. And oddly, he was using much the same stuff. He was targeting... The limp wrist was actually something that was targeted much like the flapping hands. And obviously, that's very grim. But what I find interesting is... Some of you might know that the conservative right, the conservative Christian right in the 70s, they had this notion that homosexuality was caused by overly affectionate parents. You know, that these kids would become feminine, and they were like copying their mum's mannerisms. And like, bearing in mind what we said earlier about unaffectionate parents, part of me really respects the hustle on Lovaas's part that no matter what you do as a parent, you're going to end up in his office for some reason or another. So the legacy of ABA is complicated, but I think at the very least we can say Ivor did not love ass. Yeah. Oh no, I'll quickly do that. So I really grew... One of my favorite pop culture icons when I was growing up was Sherlock Holmes, because I totally read him as autistic, because, you know, he was able to walk into a room and just instantly see the situation. He had these really narrow interests and disregard for social norms, but people had to appreciate what he did. People had to respect him. And it was like, oh, shit, I'd love to be Sherlock Holmes when I grow up. Or, I actually ended up doing my BA in English and my master's in English. I thought I might even do a PhD in, Arthur Conan Doyle's work. But neither of those happened. I mean, I'm a comedian. It's not too different from being an academic. I mean, I lie to funding providers about what I'm working on. I'm definitely not living the dream of being Sherlock Holmes. The only similarity I can think of between being Sherlock Holmes and being a stand-up comedian is insisting that cocaine is necessary for the process. And I'll leave you on that.